So Daniel, I've already done that.
Okay, now we are live on YouTube too.
Okay, great. So Vijay, you can, like, it's all yours.
Okay. Okay. Are we going to start with Nitish's flag flying?
Yes.
Okay. Look at that. Well, welcome to this 6-class course on the short history of Indian communism, or rather communism in India. It's a big debate whether there's such a thing as Indian communism specifically, or there's communism in India. Let's go with communism in India. It might be easier. What you're seeing is a picture in a site. Nitish is holding his phone up in Kerala, and there's a communist flag, because the reason we decided to hold this course is that this month is the 100th anniversary of the communist movement in India. And we thought one way to commemorate the 100 years of communism in India is to look seriously at what communism was, has been, and so on, and to look at its emergence, its history. Um, Atul, Daniel, and Nitish have been helping put this together, and they are around in the class. Some of you are watching or participating through Zoom. Um, we only have a limited Zoom capacity. To get the 500 Zoom is too expensive, and so what we've done is there's another group participating at YouTube. In both places, you can actually write questions in the chat, and whether it's Atul or Nitish or Ambedkar or somebody will, be able to gather those and bring them forward to me. Listen, we decided to do this as a lark. That is, we being Leftward Books, Tricontinental, the Indian office, and our media partner NewsClick. We decided to do this just, like that, and we have about 550 people interested in this course. So that's amazing. Who would have thought 550 people would be interested in spending 2 hours every 2 weeks on a pretty close look at the communist movement in India? So welcome from all of us, from Leftward Books, certainly, from Tricontinental, and from NewsClick. This is the first day. There will be, things that will go wrong, maybe, perhaps. I'm not sure. We'll see. I'm going to make some introductory remarks first. Then I'll go over how the course has been designed, what the 6 different classes will be, and then I'll get to work in the first hour talking about the economic and, in some senses, the social context, the prehistory of the communist movement, but the economic and social context in the first hour. In the second hour, after a very brief break, we'll look at the politics of the 19th century and the freedom struggle, because you can't understand the emergence of Indian communism or communism in India without understanding the character and nature of the freedom struggle against British rule. So that's going to be the first day. But let me just make some prefatory remarks, and then we'll go over the, as it were, syllabus. I was, maybe last month, I started reading Noam Chomsky's new book, Internationalism or Extinction. It's a great book. Chomsky begins by saying, look, we have a choice between going extinct or being internationalists. And he says that the whole extinction thing, he says, becomes a realistic concern on August 6, 1945. This is when the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. And he says it's a day that will never be forgotten by those who were alive then and had their eyes open, a day I personally remember very well. Now, it's true that in a very graphic way, the question of extinction versus internationalism, it's true, was quite vividly opened up in 1945 on the 6th of August on what we now call Hiroshima Day. That's true. On the other hand, for people in various parts of the world, in the Congo region of Africa, in parts of South Asia, the question of extinction had been posed far earlier. And indeed, in the Americas, where entire peoples had been wiped out in after 1492, by the movement of the conquistadors, and then the English and others onto the North American continent, entire peoples wiped out. For them, the question of extinction, of course, doesn't begin in 1945 on the 6th of August. It's much earlier than that. It's in 1492 and so on. Other dates are important. In the context of the South Asian theater, as it were, the issue of extinction is there from quite early, but graphically in the 19th century, which we'll talk about to some extent today. I just wanted to share with you a line from a British colonial official. Um, the 19th century, as I'll come back to it, was peppered by famines, one after the other. Punctually, famines appeared. And the British routinely blamed famines on the Indian personality, which is not true. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But right when there was a significant famine in 1897, right towards the end of the 19th century, there was already the hint that there would be a plague epidemic starting. Famines and diseases came together because people were so fundamentally weakened by malnutrition that disease found, vectors, easy vectors. So this British official writes, I think without irony at all, um, this is now again in the context of a famine where millions of people are going to perish. He writes, the Secretary of State in London was telling the Viceroy. Now, the Viceroy is the representative, as you'll remember, the Viceroy is the representative of the British in India. He's the Viceroy, the substitute for the King. The Secretary of State in London was telling the Viceroy that he was more concerned about plague than famine because a market once lost or even partially deserted is not easily regained. Just think about what he's saying. He's more concerned about plague than famine because a market once lost or even partially deserted is not easily regained. For the British in 19th century India, it was far more important to maintain markets, to maintain the ability to remove raw materials and sell finished products, far more important than to worry about the loss of human life. And therefore, plague was worse because a plague means the market will get disrupted. By the way, this echoes the anxiety today with the COVID-19 pandemic. The market being deserted has long-term costs. People dying, well, they'll die anyway, that attitude. Extinction has been on the cards for different kinds of people, on class lines, on national lines for a long time. Chomsky's warning is, I think, quite correct, that the choice is between extinction and internationalism. And we know that internationalism is simply another way to talk about the global proletarian movement. Because we know that bourgeois internationalism is about markets. It's proletarian internationalism that's about people. So, when Chomsky's book is called Extinction versus Internationalism, it really is the old Rosa Luxemburg slogan, barbarism versus socialism. It's the same choice. So what we're going to study, I think, for these 6 classes, this 12 hours together, is we're going to look at this choice fundamentally, the choice between some form of extinction for people. Look at the situation in South Asia today, where almost 1 in 2 people go to bed hungry at night. Compare that to China, where basic hunger has been taken care of. I mean, India versus China is another way of talking about capitalism versus socialism. These are 2 countries win their independence roughly the same time. India, now I'm just thinking of India. Let's set Pakistan out for a minute. Just look at the India context. India wins independence 1947, becomes a republic in 1950. The Chinese Revolution prevails in 1949. Arguably, China was in worse shape in 1949 than India had been in 1950. After all, China had its entire industrial base and much of its agriculture ravaged by civil war, long war, and by World War II. After all, World War II begins not in Europe, but in China in 1937 when the Japanese invade. That's a very long war. It runs from 1937 till 1949. Tens of millions of people killed in that war. Huge disruption. Fighting on the landmass. India didn't face that. India faced other things. For instance, famine created by Winston Churchill's government in Bengal in 1943, where between 1 and 3 million people died. India faced its own tragedies with World War II, but nothing really compared to the ravages that the Chinese faced. And in China, you have a different path set. And today, of course, the difference is stark. You ask a hungry person, which is a easier world to live in, you'd prefer to live in a world where you don't have to worry about the very elemental needs of food and so on. And as I said, in India, almost 1 in 2 people goes to bed hungry at night, a situation that doesn't prevail right now in China. So that question that Chomsky raises, internationalism versus extinction, what does extinction mean? Extinction doesn't just mean a nuclear bomb falls on the planet and we perish in the nuclear winter. Extinction also means multi-generational starvation and hunger. Nutrition levels low, the capacity to develop your brain matter diminished. Desperation and despair and indignity defining so much of everyday life. That's what extinction means also. And I want to put that directly on the table because the point I'm going to make in the first half of our class today is that communism in a place like India doesn't come from outside India. It's not imported from the USSR or from China or anywhere. Communism is part of the dialectic of human history. And that's what I'm going to argue in the first part. Okay, quickly, let's go over the syllabus we created. Again, there are 6 classes. The main book that you'll be reading is the History of the Communist Movement in India, published in 2005 from Leftward Books. There's an ebook, so I hope you were able to get it. It's a very clear and easy read, and I'm going to use it quite a lot. I think it's a fine book. The other book you could get as an ebook, Liberate the Colonies. I'll talk about that next time. I'm not going to get into it today. Each day on the syllabus, there'll be hyperlinks to articles that are easily available. If you have a hard time finding them, let us know. They should be there. I checked the links yesterday. They all seem to be there. You might have got confused with the reading today, the reading from Gandhi, because it takes you to the whole collected works volume. You just have to find the particular short piece, Russia and India. It's not hard, but don't get confused. Most of these texts, again, as I said, are online. I do encourage you to go to the Leftward site. So for instance, if you're interested in Bhagat Singh and you found merit in Why I Am an Atheist. Chaman Lal edited for us what I think is really a fine collection. It's the Jail Notebook. Um, I'll talk a little about Bhagat Singh in the second hour, but Chaman Lal is by far the most important um, really upholder of Bhagat Singh's legacy, and has done a great job in keeping the intellectual life of Bhagat Singh alive. I mean, that's the other thing. The people become icons like Che Guevara. People don't read them. It's important to read Bhagat Singh to recognize that just very, very few years he lived on the planet Earth. He was able to understand so many things. Okay, so the syllabus will go. Today is Indian radicalism before communism. Then next class will be on Lenin's breakthrough, because one of the arguments I'll make is that Leninism is really what came into places like South Asia, that our movement begins with Leninism, not with Marxism per se, because Marx was not read much. And I'll get to that in the next class. So it's about Lenin's breakthrough and the colonized world. Then the third class will be on the first four Comintern Communist International meetings and what they implied for the growth of the communist movement in India. That'll be the third class. The fourth one goes from really the most significant years, from 1920 to 1928. And that was the building of the Communist Party itself. Lots of interesting debates, lots of experiments, and this runs from 1920 to 28, largely because, well, the party was founded in 1920 in Tashkent, in the Soviet Republic, soon to be the USSR. Um, and then in 1928, most of the leadership is arrested in the Meerut conspiracy trials and so on. So not exactly then, but around then. And this period is when these radicals in different cities and their small groups begin to make contact with each other, and they start forming a network and a center. And it's really quite an interesting period to look and see how they built a movement out of what they were doing. It's also a period of immense trade union struggle. Strike activity picks up and so on. So we look very carefully at the trade union movement, at the formation of the trade union movement, because in 1920 was also, alongside the communist movement starting, was the formation of the All India Trade Union Congress, and that was also in 1920. So we'll spend time on the trade union movement, on the Kisan movement, the peasant struggles, agricultural workers struggles. We'll look at student struggles. We'll look at the freedom movement. This is the freedom movement from essentially Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 out to the beginnings of the civil disobedience movement. So right through non-cooperation and so on. So that'll be the fourth class. That'll be a lot of engagement with popular struggles. The fifth class will look at the foothold that Indian communism made in in the struggles. And here we'll spend time looking carefully at the draft plan of action 1930, because what we're going to see when we look at this text is, firstly, it's a very sophisticated text trying to understand the nature of the Indian Revolution, but also inside the text you already begin to see the fissures, the debates. You already begin to see the disagreements, the struggles, stresses, and so on. Because one of the things that happens after 1947 is that after the independence of India is that a serious line struggle will open up, which will lead to at least two major splits. One in 1964, when the Communist Party of India will produce also the Communist Party of India Marxist. Again, its anniversary, the party's anniversary is this month in 1964. And then in 1967, largely out of the CPIM will come the Naxalite movement, the Maoist movement. Much of that you can see happening inside the 1930 draft plan of action. So we'll look at that carefully. It's an excellent text. We'll also look at the debate between the socialist movement in India and the communist movement in India. This is very significant because I'll make an argument about how You can't actually build a communist movement in a place like India without having a socialist movement as well. And that'll be an argument I'll make in the fifth class. So today, in fact, where the socialist movement is almost totally been vanquished, um, that's a huge problem. It's a political problem in various parts of the country. Okay, finally, um, the last section from 33 to 47, and as you can see, it's largely chronological, but not exactly, because in each class I'll make different kinds of arguments. This is interesting, this period, because we look at some controversies, like for instance, the Quit India movement, 1942. What was the role of the communists in the Quit India movement? We look at that. We look at the emergence of the cultural fronts. We look at the role that particularly women communists played in the famine struggle in 43 in Bengal and the emergence of MAS, one of the most important Indian women's organizations. So that'll take us to independence in 47. It's a pretty artificial division, guys, and even the breakup is fairly conventional, because I thought for this kind of online class, it's better to err on the side of a conventional break than to try anything crazy. Because I have another way that I could have organized this, but I thought it just won't work in this format. So bear with us. It's pretty conventional, but so be it. Okay? So that's that. Now, the first part, I wanted to take us on a little journey to the social and economic world from the early 1800s till the 1920s. As I said, the main point that I want to make is that, you know, the what becomes the communist movement in India is the movement that speaks in the name of the immense majority. And the emergence of that movement is actually dialectically present inside the development of Indian history. So, in other words, it's not that, just to repeat what I'd said earlier, it's not that somebody from Moscow arrives, a Comintern agent, an outside agitator, as the British would say over and over again. Bolshevik agents would enter, agitators would enter, uh, enormous volumes of anxiety and paranoia produced by the British government, which gives us a lot of our material to understand early Indian communism. They put down every detail, somebody arrested at the border carrying a book and so on. These enormous volumes of intelligence that the British, put together when they said communism is coming from outside. But in fact, communism doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside the drama of Indian history itself. Because as you'll see quite early on, whether if it had been an endogamous capitalism that had developed, or it was what it was, which was a capitalism blighted by its colonial history. Either way, peasants, agricultural workers, workers in factories, office workers, and so on, anyway, were developing struggles, class struggles against the domination of whether it's a classical bourgeoisie, which you don't exactly see in India, or this combination of the colonial state, its feudal and aristocratic allies, and an incipient Indian bourgeoisie, in struggle against the desperation, needs, demands of the people. It's those struggles that dialectically produce what we label as communism. Those struggles were inevitable. They were happening anyway. You didn't need a communist party as such to have the struggles appear. The struggles predate the Communist Party. Communist Party shapes those struggles, provides a theory, provides an analysis, provides, well, it's a very strong word, but I'll use it anyway, provides some direction. But the communist movement doesn't start these struggles. These struggles predated, for 100 years, and it's in that spirit that I'm trying to make the point to you that what the British were terrified about, the entry of these agitators trained in Moscow and so on. It's true that these people coming in from Moscow, coming from Tajikistan, many of them who had gone to participate in the Khilafat movement, and I'll talk about that later, to defend the Caliph, in other words, the Ottoman Empire. They go up to Afghanistan rather than continue on to join the movement to defend the caliphate. They become communists, and they turn around and re-enter India. And incredible people, Shaukat Osmani and company, and we'll come back to them later. They're great stories. Um, it's true they played a key role. You can't think of the movement without Muzaffar Ahmad. Key role that somebody like that plays. M.N. Roy as well, and so on. Very important roles. But the drama of the communist struggle is not their struggle alone. It's also the struggle of the immense majority that were pushing against a system that was suffocating them, a system that generated famines, that generated, as I said, generations of starvation, malnutrition, and so on. So that's an important point, is that um, you know the essence of the history of Indian communism must not only be sought in its organizational form, but has to be seen also in terms of the massive waves of spontaneous and sometimes not so spontaneous struggle. It's the unity between these spontaneous struggles and the various organizational forms that we will call communism, the communist movement. It's the unity between the two. It's not just the organizational history. It's both that play a key role in what we name as the communist movement. Okay, now you can't understand the emergence of the communist movement unless we understand British imperialism and how the British reshaped, in a sense, participated in reshaping um, Indian social life, and how we see the production of new classes in India emerging. And so there's no way else that we don't have to actually start in the ancient past. I'd like you to just take it for granted that, well, people in South Asia have always struggled. We see that from the beginning of recorded history. The wretchedness of caste, for instance, in its various forms, before the 6th century, there have been movements against the wretchedness of caste over the entirety of Indian history. Um, you're familiar with Buddha, for instance. In a small way, the emergence of Buddhism is a fight against Brahmanism, and then that picks up in its own, dynamic. In the very ancient period, there are these trends, atheistic trends, the Ajivikas and others, arguing against the Brahmins, fighting against the Brahmanical approach to organizing society. This is a very old, these are very old struggles. These struggles don't need the British to enter in and shape them. These are shaped from earlier periods. I also want to make clear, secondly, the second point is that there is a fashionable trend in scholarship that suggests that imperialism arrives and produces a lot of maladies and problems, that somehow things might have been okay before then. And I want to make it clear that India didn't need the English to become wretched. The caste system was not produced by colonialism. The caste system was our own invention and device. I use the word wretched a lot because I can't think of another way to describe the caste system. That's our own making. I mean, that's our own contribution to world history. It's a very complicated system, but the attitude one takes to it should not be so complicated. It's complicated to understand, but it's not difficult to see how wretched it is. This predates British colonialism, but no doubt the British colonial state will reshape the even institutions of caste to the advantage of, or at least attempt to reshape institutions of caste to the advantage of British colonial rule. You can see, though, um, the infirmity of caste, not only to those who suffered terribly from its indignity, people who were, treated with great oppression. And I'm thinking about, Dalits, for instance, the so-called previously called untouchables or depressed classes, as the British named them, Dalits, another oppressed caste. Not only was the infirmity felt personally and familiarly and again intergenerationally, but also the society actually suffered from the malady of caste. And this becomes clear when you look carefully at um, economic activity. You know, there's a hesitancy to accept the fact that prior to, let's say, the 18th century or even the 17th century, there's hesitancy to accept the fact that in large parts of India or the subcontinent, large parts of the subcontinent, uh, villages and localities were fairly self-contained. And what allows them to be so self-contained is the infirmity of caste. In other words, the very fine granulated division of labor, the production of goods and services for consumption in villages and small regions, the lack of enormous amounts of trade. This self-sufficiency played a part in what we think of as the the less developed nature of Indian technology. Particularly in this middle period, there were some amazing technological breakthroughs. Irfan Habib and his team have produced a series of books that are excellent, and you should look at them, published by Tulika. Excellent series where they show you the various developments in agriculture and so on. But there's one volume in particular on that, very much to be recommended. But by and large, there was, and I'm going to use words that I know that the scholars, concerned about Orientalism and so on, don't like to use anymore. But I think that there was a great loss in criticizing the way in which previous scholars talked about India. There was a loss in saying, no, society was dynamic. It wasn't actually that dynamic, friends. It was fairly, and here's the word, it was fairly involuted. There was a fair amount of lack of energy in social life. There was a lot of really quite vicious exploitation of labor without the development of technology to substitute for labor. Vicious exploitation of labor, and the caste system or caste hierarchy was the instrument of drawing labor out, human labor, for the production of surplus. You see this, right up till at least the 18th century, that where caste becomes the disciplinary instrument. Caste is the main disciplinary instrument to draw more and more surplus from human labor. There was no necessity, there was no incentive to invest in agricultural and artisanal activity, no real incentive, because you were able to get, using the disciplinary instrument of caste, you were able to get returns from labor, sufficient returns from labor. Most of the trade that you see in the mandis, for instance, up and down the Gangetic plain, most of the trade is in luxury goods, not in necessities, and that's partly because of the kind of local nature of markets, local nature of consumption. When previous people came into the subcontinent, this, of course, most recently at that period would have been the Mughals. They settled into the subcontinent, into the life of the subcontinent. They didn't have, they broke most of their connections with their ancestral regions. So when Babur comes in, he breaks largely his ties with the Fargana Valley in Afghanistan. In fact, if you read Babarnama, he writes with great feeling about the melons of the Fargana Valley, which he has not tasted in a long time. There's a break with the places they came from. Occasionally, there will be a return, so that Humayun will seek a refuge in Persia, for a time before he comes back. But the point is that the rulers, particularly in the northern part of the subcontinent, break their links with their homelands from which they came and settle into the world in which they live now. Uh, this is important. On the one side, as I said, there is a kind of involution of production. There is the use of the disciplinary mechanism of caste to draw immense amounts of surplus from agriculture, from artisanal production, and so on. But on the other hand, the over rulers, the emperors and so on, that come in, um, they settle into the society. So whatever wealth is produced in the society remains in the society. This becomes very important when you compare it to what happens when the Europeans arrive. Um, but part of the reason for this is also technological, that it was not possible to keep going back and forth. We see that in the upper steppes region, when the Mongols went into Europe, they couldn't keep their logistical chain intact from their homelands, and then therefore they were not able to develop such a vast empire. Um, they could ride back and forth on the steppes, but they were not capable of creating an imperial infrastructure of that scale. It just technologically was not possible for them. In the same way, it would have been impossible for the Mughals to maintain a huge empire into Central Asia. So they break with it. By the time the Europeans arrive, technologically it's possible to have linkages between, say, Goa and Portugal, because you go by sea and the ships can go back and forth, and there is a connection that is maintained. And later, when the English East India Company arrives and takes the Diwani in Bengal in 1757, it's possible for the ships to go back and forth fairly quickly in comparison to what it had been before. And I mean, England is much further than the Fargana Valley for the Mughals. So the second important point is that up to the emergence of the Europeans, most of the people who came in as invaders or who came in as traders ended up settling in, which is exactly why uh, a place like South Asia has basically everything in it. I mean, it is culturally and socially extraordinarily diverse. It's sometimes puzzling for people to learn that Christianity came to South Asia before it came to Europe. That in fact, one of the apostles, Saint Thomas, comes to India and dies near today's Chennai. There's a little hillock near Nundumbakam called, Saint Thomas Mount, and it is said he was killed there. So, the point I'm just trying to make is that, um, you know, these earlier invaders or these earlier traders or these earlier settlers come settle and they remain. And this is very important for the economic life of a society, that they remain. And it'll become clearer when I come back to it in a minute. Okay. So when the Europeans do arrive, and they come at different periods, they come as traders, as sometimes as missionaries, but less of that, mainly traders. When the Portuguese first arrive, Vasco da Gama will arrive in what is today Kerala. He will confront this person known as the Lord of the Sea, essentially, and the Portuguese basically militarize the Indian Ocean and dominate trade. And a trade that was not exactly militarized before the Portuguese. It was it was not a zone of peace. I think that's going too far, but it was not as militarized as when the Portuguese arrived. They just came and started attacking everybody. Um, and when the early traders come, they set up trading posts along the coastline known as forts or factories. It's not a factory where you produce things. A factory was a warehouse essentially, and most of the internal monarchs and emperors and so on didn't pay any heed to them because they didn't actually think of trade as a major source of wealth. So they didn't take trade seriously. Remember, I said a lot of trade was in luxury goods, not in necessity. So the volume was not great. The real wealth was from land revenue, from the land, and that was where wealth was. So they didn't actually confront the Europeans and attempt to, dispatch them, because in the early years it would have been easy for the Mughals, for instance, to militarily confront the Europeans. They just didn't bother. They didn't take them seriously. They saw them as just another trader who's come to trade for luxury goods and so on, which is what to some extent they were doing. Um, in 1757, the English East India Company, and oh, this is an important point. The English don't arrive as under the flag of the Queen or the King. They don't arrive as a force of the British Empire. They arrive as a joint stock company. And here we get a sniff of the emergence of capitalism. Because what's going to be the problem faced by the subcontinent is that this, I mean, look, I'm going to use these words and you'll say, oh God, it sounds so ancient. I'm going to say relatively static economic life in India, relatively static. And you say, oh God, no, it was dynamic and so on. Not really. It was relatively static economic life. Not that the social life and so on didn't have its dynamism, cultural life had its dynamism, but economic life was fairly static. There was, again, caste as the disciplinary mechanism to draw surplus using human labor, in ways that are, horrible, terrible use of human labor. Uh, and then the disciplinary mechanisms of caste to make, to attempt to strip the dignity from people and so on, all of that to draw surplus from the soil, make land revenue the core basis of these states like the Mughal Empire and all the others, Vijayanagar, the Malabar, all these areas, all across India, the Pulkiya states later, and so on. So what we have is we have this relatively static system of economic exploitation inside India will confront the emergence of a capitalist system, because the East India Company, English East India Company, set up in 1598, I believe, 1598. Was set up as a joint stock company. In other words, different people took shares in the company, and that was how they balanced their risk. If I'm a single owner and I hire or buy a ship and I send it out and the ship sinks, I lose everything. But if 20 of us take shares in the company and the 20 of us together buy the ship, and if the ship sinks, well, I lose 1/20th of the value, not 100% of it. So joint stock companies are a very clever way of sharing risk and also raising greater capital, because that's how capitalism functions today. That's what the share market is, that you go out there to raise. Well, the East India Company was an early company like these multinational firms now. And it's that company that comes to Bengal and will eventually take over the Diwani in Bengal, and they'll appeal to the Mughal emperor in 1757 saying, look, we are not challenging you. We simply are going to be like another one of your provincial governors. So rather than, Sirajuddaula, you'll have Robert Clive, and Robert Clive will be a Nawab, and he will just deal with you, and we'll send you whatever, you need so many shawls and respect, and we'll send you so much of the land revenue, every periodically. But of course, the English had other ideas as a joint stock company. They were not there merely to settle. This is contrary to William Dalrymple's book, White Mughals. I think that approach is so romantic, so unnecessary, because these English people who come in and settle are not actually settling in the same way as earlier people came and settled, because even if they lived in Calcutta, what becomes Calcutta, even if they lived in Calcutta, even if they enjoyed Hindustani music, even if all this is true, the structure of what they were doing was to remove the wealth out of Bengal and take it elsewhere. And I'll come back to that in a minute. This is exactly what was happening underneath and beneath the white Mughal. So they're not actually, there's no difference between, like, one of the things you see in Dalrymple is the argument that until the 1857 rebellion, the English were part of Indian society. But that may be true socially and culturally, but economically, they were already leaching the wealth out of India. And that, I think, is the real significant part of it. Because what's significant about colonialism wasn't that you had an English person as the Nawab of Bengal, because you had Persians come in, you had Afghans come in, like Babur was, well, for all practical purposes, he was a Chagatai Turk, but he was an Afghan. You had people from all over come in and govern parts of the country, but they were not governing. So, in other words, we shouldn't have a uh, chauvinistic attitude towards British colonialism. The problem with British colonialism wasn't that they were English people. I don't have a chauvinistic attitude towards colonialism. Anybody can come in and live and deal. We are internationalists. We don't have a chauvinistic attitude. The problem with colonialism wasn't that they were English. That's not the problem. The problem was that a structure of exploitation was constructed that leached wealth out of the society. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. That's the problem of colonialism. Okay? So come back to that in a minute. Now, the important thing to understand, and Bengal is a good place to have this as an example to understand the whole structure through Bengal. 1757, the English East India Company come in and become essentially the Nawabs of Bengal. They become the provincial governors for the Mughal emperor in Delhi, in Bengal. And the interest they have in Bengal is fascinating. So I'm going to make everything a little simple just to get through this quickly, and so that you'll understand what I'm trying to get at. The English early on developed a taste for tea. This is the tea that comes from China. Now, you got to remember that in India, nobody really drank tea till the 19th century. We began to drink tea because there was a surplus of tea, and then English tea companies started dumping it and advertising it in India. But in India, tea drinking wasn't something that goes back to the ancient times. It's more something drunk in China. And the English developed a taste, and there was an enormous demand for tea inside Britain and parts of Europe. So the East India Company was buying tea from the Chinese, but paying the Chinese in bullion, in gold and silver, which was being mined from South America, from places like the mountain of Potosi in Bolivia. The Spanish were stealing the silver from South America, bringing it to Spain. From Spain, they were leaching their silver to Britain because they were buying from the British flax and wool clothing, manufactured in small artisanal factories in England. That silver was used by the East India Company to pay the Chinese to buy tea. The Chinese refused to accept any other commodity. The Chinese have always been extraordinarily good at trade relations, as you can see now with the US. So the Chinese said to the English, look, we don't need anything. We have everything. So you just give us silver and gold. And the English didn't want to. So the English uncovered two different things that they could put on the Chinese. One is they began to sell them sea slugs, which they would harvest from the island of Fiji, which is why the English colonized Fiji and took all these Indian laborers from Bihar and the Gangetic Plain to go and work there. But you can't sell so many sea slugs to get all the tea they wanted. So you needed another commodity. Well, the other commodity was opium. And the opium, of course, as you know, was cultivated in Bihar and in Bengal, in the Diwani that the British had. And so they fought two wars against the Chinese to force them to take opium from the English. Chinese refused, the emperor refused, the people were not keen, but they forced them to get addicted to opium. Those were the two great opium wars. By the way, all these companies that are familiar to people, if you've been to Hong Kong ever or you know anything about British capitalism, all these companies, Barclays Bank, Jardine Matheson, all these companies made their money on selling opium in China, including two famous American firms. One is Forbes. The Forbes family made its wealth in the opium trade, and so you've got now Forbes magazine saying who was the billionaires and so on. Their money was made basically in the opium trade initially. Also in New York City, there's a very fashionable part of New York called Astor Place. Well, the Astor family makes its money in the opium trade. I mean, it's incredible. Now there are these so-called old money families. These old money families smell like opium, and they are the ones that force the Chinese to take opium. You've got to understand that in China there is a long memory of those opium wars, unforgotten memory. So when they see these trade wars taking place, the echo with the opium war is very clear. They are being forced to do something by an external force. Anyway, getting away from the point. The Diwani in Bengal was important for the East India Company because it created opium plantations, and it also would use land revenue to finance opium, which was then foisted on the Chinese, and they would get the tea, which then they would sell to enormous profits in Europe. Now, think about this. They invested zero because they became land revenue collectors. They took land revenue from the people, used that to buy the opium, took the opium, exchanged it for tea, took the tea and got exchanged that for money. So in fact, the East India Company was making profits without any investment. It was an enormous deal for them. And they used their profits to to recruit more military forces and so on. And that's really how they expand inside the Indian subcontinent. I mean, the expansion is not coming because they want to conquer India. No, but India provided the automatic money generating machine, the ATM machine where you can just go in and take money out, but you don't need a bank account. They just go and they just take this land revenue because they had the Diwani, and that land revenue then enabled them to start this perpetual motion machine of profit, where their own investment was virtually nil. And this is the structure of imperialism, separate from earlier rulers that were there in India, because the purpose of British colonial enterprise was not only to govern, but to remove the wealth from the society, to take the wealth produced by the working people of that society and take it for benefit somewhere else. That's, to my mind, the definition of imperialism. It's pretty simple. I know there's a million books written on imperialism. There are complexities and so on, but the basic thing is it's geographical. The wealth created by people here is no longer to go toward those people's benefit. So people in Bengal who produce wealth, again, through a wretched system of disciplinary mechanisms of caste and so on, the wealth produced by the people here will not go to their benefit, but will be removed from there, and it will go to the benefit of people who didn't create that wealth. That's basically the structure of British imperialism, that vast amounts of wealth was taken out of India and taken to benefit England. Utsa Patnaik recently threw a number out, and I'll give you her number. From 1765, that's roughly the Diwani in Bengal. In Bengal, 1757, the Battle of Plassey is when the British or the East India Company gets Diwani, the right to collect land revenue in the greater province of Bengal, which includes today's Bihar, parts of Orissa, and so on. all of Bengal, including today's Bangladesh. Um, and so from 1765, Utsa Patnaik argues, till 1938, the British took out, and this is her figure, $45 trillion was leached out of India to benefit England. Um, that's an enormous amount of wealth taken out of a society and put elsewhere, and that too without largely changing the structure of exploitation. Um, you see, if you're taking out so much wealth from a society, you're not investing um, the wealth back into the society to make improvements in agriculture or to make improvements in the nature and status of labor. Um, for that you need to invest in agriculture. There were some investments, of course, investments in the railroad, but the railroad was developed essentially to remove goods from the interior of the country to the ports. The railroad was not created with the idea that it's to facilitate the transport of people to improve their lives. The railroad was created to remove goods. There were those investments. There were some investments building canals, like in the canal colonies in Punjab in the late 19th century. But those investments were not done, again, to improve the lives of the people, but to make the soil there very fertile, more fertile. It didn't actually change much of the social relations of production. Again, heavy reliance on disciplinary forms of caste to exploit labor. That continues not only through colonial period, but even into our own times. That continues. So the first point here is that the colonial system it didn't actually fundamentally alter the nature of the labor regimes in the country, and I'm going to make a few points about that. Whereas capitalism develops, you see a tendency to substitute labor with machines. There is a tendency, if you read Marx, my favorite T-shirt, Capital Volume 1, super chapter on the machine. There's a tendency in capital to substitute human labor by machines for a host of reasons. We don't need to. In the case of India, that substitution doesn't happen. And there's many explanations for that. Let me just go through them one by one. The first is, of course, again, the rigidities, the habits of the caste system. This feeling that certain people are fated to do certain jobs, and you don't need machines to improve the condition of their labor. The best example of this is the fact that in the Republic of India, even though it's illegal, 1 million people still physically go into sewers to clean sewers. I mean, the most repulsive thing about the Indian labor market is the fact that 1 million people have to do this, and people die all the time from this. It's just a disgusting job, which is easily done by machines. There are machines available all over the world that can go in, mechanized robots that go and clean sewers. And yet in India, 1 million people enter, and it's basically on caste lines. This rigidity of caste allows machines not to substitute for human labor. That's one. Secondly, the conventional argument is there's an abundance of labor. So many people out there, why would you substitute people for machines when there's all these people out there? And also the labor, because of caste, and caste plays a role in pricing of labor as well, because of caste and because of the so-called the not only availability but cheapness of labor. Why would you substitute machines? A good example is in Indian homes, domestic labor doesn't necessarily use machines in most cases to clean houses. You don't have the need to have vacuum cleaners, and you don't have the need to have, why would you need a vacuum cleaner when you can have somebody get on their knees and do a pochai of the floor? Just wipe the floor with a cloth, wet cloth. Why do you need a vacuum cleaner? You have a human being who will do that because of the abundance of labor, desperation, and caste all together bundled in. So this substitution of of human labor by machines doesn't take place across various forms of exploitation of labor. This goes from domestic labor out to factories. You don't have good equipment. I mean, it's a stunning thing that it took so long for street sweepers in India to get the standing broom, be able to stand, keep your back erect and sweep the street. I mean, that advance took so much effort. When it's such an easy thing, you just have a larger handle. It's not a huge technological, but a larger handle means a more expensive broom. So better just to have people bend down with small brooms, and or then you can ask, do you really need human beings to do that? I mean, there are ways to mechanize that as well. Is that necessary? And so on. Okay, then there's a lack of economic incentive to invest in the development of social relations and so on. The profits are being made anyway. One of the things about imperialism initially is that there is an extraordinary short-term way in which it operates. You don't want to necessarily invest a lot of money. You want to take out as much as you can. This form of imperialism is very much like finance capital. There is really no need to invest enormous amounts because that's a long-term project. You have to have some long-term commitments if you want to make big investments. So there was as much leeching going on as possible. Okay, so as I said, these forms of land exploitation of labor uh, brutalized people. I mean, I make a distinction between the commodification of labor in certain enclaves in the world economy and the animalization or brutalization of labor in other areas. So, for instance, when you say the commodification of labor, you mean that a human being who's dispossessed from the ability to make a living outside selling their labor power to the capitalist, they sell their labor power as a commodity. They freely sell their labor power as a commodity. Marx says this freedom comes in two different ways. One is free in that they are free from bondage, from serfdom, but also they are free to starve. That's the negative kind of freedom there. So they're free to sell their labor power, and so then labor is commodified. You commodify, you make your labor power into a commodity. But in many cases, outside these enclaves of commodification of labor, you have brutalization or animalization of labor, where again you use these hierarchies of caste, you use the desperation of people, violence and so on, to force people into certain forms of production. And I'm talking not just in the 19th century, I'm talking about today. In Haryana, for instance, the Siri forms of theft from workers in most parts of the world, you have enormous wage theft taking place of agricultural laborers and so on. Wage theft is built into the system. It's not anterior to the capitalist system. It's actually part and parcel. So when people talk about the commodification of labor, that happens simultaneously with these other forms of real brutalization of labor that take place, using social hierarchy of gender, of caste, of race, and so on as fundamental to the system of exploitation. Okay, so that's the structure very quickly of the British colonial state. I mean, it comes in, or the East India Company comes in, you start seeing vast amounts of wealth being leached out of the country. You don't see much improvements. And then you see the emergence of these punctual famines. 1757 is the Diwani in Bengal. In 1770, 13 years later, there is a catastrophic famine in Bengal where 1/3 of the population dies. I mean, just think about that. 1757, the British take Diwani they take the right to collect land revenue in Bengal, and 13 years later, there's a famine, 1/3 of the population dies. And then from 1770 famine right till 1943 famine in Bengal, you have these famines come one after the other. It's impossible to understand the famines as somehow natural to Indian life, because these famines were not happening at that level prior to the imperial conquest. Um, so famine, starvation, the commodification of land. So as the British began to rely on Diwani, or the collection of land revenue, to finance their operations, collecting land revenue was very important to their practice. And they set land revenue collection cleverly. It was often not in kind, but in cash. They commercialized or monetized land revenue, not everywhere, but in many places, most places, they monetized land revenue. And what this meant is that if people were not able in a bad year to pay land revenue, they would either get evicted from their land, or they'd have to borrow from money lenders. So you had the commercialization of agriculture take place in the 19th century. You had increasing economic despair of small cultivators. You had lots of people pushed off the land, and the growth of an agrarian proletariat, essentially. In 1890s, Lenin did a study in Russia. The book was called The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Um, you know, somebody could have written this book in India as well, The Development of Capitalism in India in the 1890s, and they would have found similar things, that in India as well, the agriculture had already become, it was no longer feudal. It was full-fledged capitalist agriculture, because people were producing for markets, for the commodity market, away from themselves. This was not self-sufficient production. They were not able to withstand, in a sense, capitalism. What I'm trying to argue is that it wasn't the British that colonized India. Um, it was imperialism that colonized India. In other words, it was a very dynamic capitalist system that overcame these earlier forms of economic activity and political life. They overcame them without destroying them. This is something Marx recognized as early as 1853. He says, in that very important line, let me just find it and quote it, then we'll take a break for a few minutes. He says England has, this is in 1853, England has to fulfill a double mission in India, one destructive, the other regenerating, the annihilation of old Asiatic society and the laying of the material foundation of Western society. So one destructive, destroying the old society, the other regenerative, to produce a capitalist order. But then later, by the 1860s, Marx will write that no, they didn't do that. They didn't do that because they didn't destroy Asiatic society. They took what they found and they made it useful for the extraction of labor power. So it didn't take the revolt of 1857, which we'll start with in the second hour. It didn't take the revolt of 1857 for the British to start to compromise with the old elites. They were already doing that from the beginning. The form in which they were developing capitalism in India was in collusion with the wretchedness of caste, the advantages of patriarchy and so on. These were not going to be challenged. They were already being drawn in, and you see that in how plantations were organized in Bihar, and you get this very clearly in the indigo plantations as well. There was a play written called Neel Darpan in 1861, which was a critique of the indigo plantation society, which brings out quite well how indigo plantation work was not on a modern footing, but utilized again the disciplinary mechanisms of caste, of gender, and so on, to extract maximum amount of labor for minimum amount of recompense, minimum payment. So from early on, the twin tasks of the British were not being fulfilled. One, to destroy the old society, to destroy Indian feudalism. No, it was never destroyed. It was taken and utilized for the ultimate gain, which was to extract profit from Indian society to the benefit of England. Before we take the break, quick thing, to the benefit of England. Because after all, British industry was financed almost entirely by the trade in Asia, by the horrible trade in human beings across the Atlantic, by the plantation society in North America. All of that finances British industry. When our friend Max Weber shows up in the early 20th century and says that capitalism is produced because of Protestantism and savings, he's dreaming. It wasn't Protestant saving that financed the factories of Manchester and the Midlands and so on. It was the theft from the colonies, and which is why, Marx writes in Capital, in the last part of Capital, he says, capital comes dripping from the earth with blood and gore. He talks about, the colonization of the world and the slave trade and so on. He says he calls that primitive accumulation. That's the original capital fund. That's the original accumulation of capital funds that sets capital accumulation going. Capital accumulation doesn't start by savings, it starts by theft. That's the essence of early imperialism. It was the theft of labor converted into capital that could then accumulate, and that capital can then stare at the Indian peasant and say, sorry, you have to borrow from me at high rates of interest. You can't steal back from me. The original theft is masked as property. The original theft of labor is masked now as my property, not yours. And you can borrow at high rates of interest and so on. So that's the trick of capitalism. And what I'm trying to say is that by the late 19th century, India was not some semi-feudal place. It had been absorbed into the world capitalist system, and even labor regimes deep inside India, even labor regimes deep inside, rural India, had been impacted by the commercialization of agriculture. So much so that the great uprisings in the Deccan in the 1870s, when the peasants rose up, they didn't go and necessarily kill the local feudal lords and things like that, the local sheriffs and all that. They went straight to the moneylender's house and they burnt the books of the moneylender in the Deccan uprising in 1875. I mean, they knew that these peasants knew that their enemy was abstract forms of capitalism. It wasn't the concrete form of some jackass who was the local governor. They avoided their house. Sometimes they went and burnt the house down as well, but they made a beeline. They went directly to the moneylender's house and burnt the moneylender's books, because that was an effective way of fighting against the concrete forms, concrete manifestation of the abstract structure of capitalism, of the commerce that had made them unable to lead full lives. Okay, shall we take a 5-minute break? I'm going to read through the chat, take a 5-minute
Sure,
break,
sure.
and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. We'll start with 1857. Okay, now to read all these chats.
I'll
I'm not
post
going
the
to read
questions
all of
for
them.
you again.
Yeah. Please, Atul, because otherwise I'll be reading. I'll eat an orange. Atul, you'll post it in the chat or where? Oh, here. Okay.
Yes.
Hmm.
Purvasha wants songs.
Next class songs. Okay, Purvasha. Okay, Atul, should we go?
Yes.
I think so, right? Okay. Quickly, I'll run through some of the questions. They're good questions. I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but they're good questions. Quickly, um, so quickly, land revenue. So when the British came to India, there were two forms in which the land revenue, two big forms in which the land revenue system was put in place. One was in Bengal, called the Zamindari system, which came with the permanent settlement of 1793, where the British basically, or the East India Company, created these zamindars, or these people who were the landlords. They created a landlord class, and this landlord class was the one that would maintain disciplinary structures in the zamindaris, and would collect revenue and then pass it over to the British. So that was the system that they did in Greater Bengal and in other parts of the country as well. It's called the Zamindari system. It's very clever because they supplanted the institutions of the Mughal state. They created their own institutions and their own forms of loyalty. And often these zamindars didn't come from Bengal. They were freebooters. They came from Punjab and other places. Um, when you see these zamindari families today, like the what's it, the Bardwan family of Bengal, they are Punjabis that come from Punjab. They are not from Bengal. Kuch Bihar family and so on. So that was in the Bengal, what later becomes the Bengal presidency. In South India, Thomas Munro, who actually, I think personally had read David Ricardo and even Mill and others. But anyway, they created the Rayatwari system, where Rayatwari was interesting because it was direct. The state deals directly with the cultivator, and these are farmers, not landlords, and the state will collect land revenue from the farmer. And so what the British basically did was they taxed agricultural incomes across the board, and they collected it either through an intermediary or directly through the riot or the farmer. And that land revenue was enormous in its volumes, and it's what finances not only uh, the the East India Company operations in most of Asia, but it ended up financing the construction of the British Army. There's studies of how this wealth was taken and was utilized to finance the army. This study was done in the 19th century by a person who is well worth reading. His name is Dadabhai Nauroji. Nauroji becomes the president of the Congress in 1907. He's the consensus candidate between the extremists and the moderates. But in the 19th century, Dadabhai Nauroji writes a book, phenomenal study, where he talks about the drain of wealth from India. That's the phrase, the drain of wealth. And he shows how these imperial charges that India was being billed essentially to pay for the institutions of imperialism, including to pay for the military. So that's what land revenue was able to provide. Um, no, of course, look, the point is being asked, is the CPI, the Communist Party of India, the beginning of the movement? Because well, today's whole class is actually making the argument that the communist movement is 100 years old, but its prehistory is as important as its history. So I hope that is clear. Can you say that Savarnas from the bourgeoisie in India? Well, you can't actually say that upper castes form the bourgeoisie in India, because even though there is a high correlation between caste and class, it's not identical. That caste and class are not identical systems, in the same way as race and class are not identical. There will be some people who are Brahmins who will be wretchedly poor and will be working as landless laborers and so on. There is no one-to-one identical relation, but there is a very strong relationship between caste and class. Very strong relationship. And later in the course, we will look at Ambedkar's writings on some of these issues, because Ambedkar himself, self-professed liberal, he sees himself as a constitutional liberal. His interrogation of Marxism, at Leftward, we published an unfinished book of his called India and Communism. His interrogation of Marxism is very important to his understanding of the nature of caste in India. From his first seminar paper that he delivers at Columbia University on the origins of caste in India onward, you see the impact of his of dialectical thinking and so on. So it's not, you can't say that Savarnas are the bourgeoisie of India. That's too lazy thinking. But you can say there is a very high relationship between caste and class in India. That is to say that the elite suffers from a lack of families from oppressed castes. That much is very clear. Okay, quickly one more question, and then I'm going to move on. Okay, this is, you said the disciplinary structure of caste was used to extract labor. Was that true for indentured labor as well? Yes, it was true, but for indentured labor, that's not only indentured labor that goes from South India and the Gangetic Plain to the Caribbean or to Southern Africa or to Fiji and so on. Not only there, but also within the country, because you have indentured labor coming from northeastern India into the mines of Jharkhand, today's Jharkhand and Bihar and so on. Indentured labor within the territory of the subcontinent. Indentured labor had the second negative problem from the laborer standpoint, which is that they worked on very harsh contracts. You had to, work on a plantation. You had so many years. You couldn't go home. You had no opportunity for any freedom. You had to live on the plantation and so on. So yeah, I mean, caste was a structure of this because only certain people were brought into indentured contracts. But the nature of indenture was basically almost self-identical to the nature of enslavement, except it was time-bound enslavement and not lifetime of enslavement. Okay, let's move on. As I said, right from the beginning of Diwani, there were protests against British rule. Some of these protests were, in a sense, defensive protests. So you saw the Sannyasi and Fakir rebellions in the 1700s, late 1700s in Bengal and in the Gangetic Plain. These were defensive. You see peasant uprisings from the 1700s right till the British leave the country, often defensive. In other words, saying, no, we don't want to give so much of our crop to you as tax. Even to some extent, the Tibhaga movement in Bengal in the 1940s is a defensive movement because the agricultural workers are saying we don't want to give such an enormous amount of the surplus to the state. We want to hold on to some of it. I use the word defensive in order to say these were movements of economic survival in many cases. They were also defensive because in some areas of the country where there was tribal, relationships to land and to forests and to waters and so on, the intervention of the colonial state was often the first time they had experienced full-blown intervention into their economic lives. So their uprisings were often defensive. For instance, the Shanthal Hul, the uprising of the Shanthal people, again in Bengal, what becomes Bengal presidency, that uprising is a defensive uprising, saying this is our land, this is our way of doing things, you can't tell us how to do things. And you see a whole bunch of uprisings of tribal livelihoods against the intervention of a colonial state, of traders and so on. So those are what I characterize as defensive. They're about survival, they're against encroachment, they're against the commercialization of agriculture, the commercialization of everyday life. So lots of defensive struggles. Then there are restorative struggles. These start quite early, saying, no, we don't like your way of doing things. We want to restore the old ways. So you see restorative struggles taking place as early, in southern India, you see these quite early, where the British or the colonials, not just the British, the French in some parts, are trying to supplant the intermediaries, the local intermediary of the overlord, whether it's the Mughal emperor or whoever. They're trying to supplant the intermediary. So the intermediary, who often has emotional links to their peasantry and the military forces and so on, is able to recruit people for their return to power. These restorative struggles are most sharply delineated in the 1857 rising. I'll come back to that. The third thing is, you see uprisings of the military recruited by the English East India Company. So the English East India Company would hire people to join their ranks to become a military force of the East India Company, and these soldiers would mutiny routinely. An early mutiny was in the year 1800 in Vellore in southern India, where the mutiny took place around issues again of animal fat, and because the technology of the European military forces, they were using guns that required greased cartridges, and the cartridges had to be greased by animal fat. And certain people were worried, is it pork fat? Is it beef fat? What's the fat in this? And do we have to rip the cartridge with our mouth and so on, or wearing animal products as part of the uniform? So Vellore was an early example of that kind of mutiny. That was in 1800. Well, a lot of this stuff comes together in 1857. It's wrong to call 1857 an Indian mutiny, because it's not really. I mean, there's very little of an uprising in 1857 in the southern part of the subcontinent. Very little. In fact, the main uprising is actually the soldiers. The British said it was a sepoy mutiny. They were too narrow in that interpretation, but there was a lot of soldier rebellions. That's one. Mangal Pandey's uprising in Barakpur in beginning the rebellion just out, well, now part of Calcutta, where in the old barracks, Mangal Pandey says, I don't want to rip the thing, and the rebellion starts. In Meerut, in the barracks of Meerut, north of Delhi, another military mutiny. That's one. Secondly, restorative. People will say, we want our kings back, so that from Meerut, the soldiers will ride down to Delhi and beg Bahadur Shah Zafar and say to the last Mughal king, please become the emperor again. And old Bahadur Shah Zafar, who's much keener on writing poetry and had totally lost interest in rule, his ego was stoked, and he, says, okay, I'll be the emperor again. But it's not just Bahadur Shah Zafar, it's also the Rani of Jhansi and others who will appear and try to restore their power. They had been fighting narrow battles with the British administration over who gets to be the heir in her throne. In her case, she wanted her son and so on. She rises up in revolt. So restorative. So one is the military. Second is restorative. The third in the Diwani or the Nawabi, the Nawab of Awadh's kingdom in northern India, which had recently been taken over by the British. And by the way, you got to watch Satyajit Ray's film Satranj Ki Khilari. It's a great film. It's based on a Premchand short story, and it's about Awadh. And in Awadh, which is the central area of the Gangetic Plains, Lucknow and that region. When the rising happens in Awadh, it is actually a general rising against British rule. That's the one place where you see a mass uprising. You don't really see mass uprising in the rest of the territory, but there it's a mass uprising. This is an enormously powerful upsurge against British rule. And I just want to make 2 or 3 quick points here. One is that it was crushed, they were defeated, and Delhi was taken, and there was the East India Company supplants itself and puts the British state firmly in power. Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India and so on. But the reason it was crushed was twofold. One was disunity among the people, great disunity on regional caste lines and so on. disunity didn't help this uprising. Secondly, sections of other kingdoms came to the aid of the British. For instance, the King of Nepal joins various, Pulkia state, I guess let's call them, for better word, kings of the Pulkia states will join. I think Patiala joins and various others join the British against the uprising, and they get rewarded after. After the uprising is crushed. By the way, side thing in Nepal, when the casinos were big, they used to call a big win in the casino a Lucknow loot. The word loot comes from this period. The Nepali soldiers were told, if you take Lucknow, you can take whatever you want back home from there. That was the Lucknow loot, and they participated in the crushing of the rebellion in Lucknow. So this was the fragility of the uprising. It was a great uprising against British rule, but there were internal problems, and it couldn't consolidate itself. Okay, now let's move on. Right through the 19th century, and this is one of the best parts of the introduction here, right through the 19th century, page 14, 15, 16, there was an interest amongst the new intelligentsia that was emerging. See, out of the contradictions of British rule emerged a section of people who looked at what was happening outside their window. These were mostly middle class intellectuals. They looked out of their window and they saw great suffering. There is a kind of Buddha quality to this. When Buddha looks out of the palace and sees suffering and then travels around and is greatly moved, he decides to renounce his princeness. He was a prince, and to go and live in the grove and meditate and so on. There's an element of some of this, except that some of these people, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, begin to make the argument that Indian society was so quickly able to be colonized because there are weaknesses in the society, and that weakness needs to be rectified. And you see the beginning of a social reform movement. This is not just a lot of my examples are in Bengal, friends. That's just because I know that the best, but there are examples from other parts of the world, not only, other parts of the territory. Ram Mohan Roy is a significant figure. He will make the argument against problems within Indian society, problems of hierarchy, caste, gender, and so on. And they say we need to start reforming our own society. Early on, this trajectory of middle class radical will take an interest in socialist ideas. So it's in fact in the Bengal Spectator. This is page 14. Which is the magazine of Young Bengal Movement, which included a number of these middle class poets and thinkers who were trying to understand why are we colonized. In that newspaper, Bengal Spectator, November 1st, 1842, there are references to Chartism, to the Chartist movement in England, the early socialist movement, which Marx and Engels write about as well. But from then onwards, the book details 1858 in the Hindu Patriot. There are writings about what happens to the Chartist movement. And then remarkably in 1871, when the first international is created in England, the first international of socialists, essentially, somebody from Calcutta writes and says, we would like to join the first international. And it's quite charming. The response comes, the revolution which will take place in India, say the international, as its sequel, will surpass all the revolutions that have taken place so far. The international is rightly in consonance with the aims and aspirations of the working class in India. 1871. Actually, this is important because by 1871, we already have the emergence of strike activity taking place in the railroads. We already have, as I said, agricultural workers uprisings, and 1875 is the Great Deccan Uprising, 4 years after this statement, and so on. So it's not that they are writing in an emotional way. They look out of their window, they see suffering, but they also see the movement of workers. They see the movement of agricultural workers, industrial workers, plantation workers, and so on. Demonstrations of a syndicalist kind, working class, are already apparent to people, these people. It's so interesting to see that quite mainstream figures like page 16, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, mainstream figure, novelist, and so on. He is the one who will write about socialism, communism, internationalism. Tagore, there's a long quote from Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, one of the most significant thinkers on nationalism and imperialism in his period. Of course, also a poet and so on. He will write in this long quote that they have, 1892, a text called Socialism. He writes about the socialist movement and so on. He says, in response, the present author agrees that the non-feasibility of the existence of freedom without wealth is a truth. In other words, you can't have freedom unless you have social wealth. He says that's something I agree with, and this is Tagore, kind of iconic figure. The impact of socialism is not only what they are reading from what's happening particularly in England, but it's also what they are seeing outside their window, is that the validity of the socialist experiment is not imported. It's actually, the validity is a reflection of the wretched condition of social life that they see and the struggles of people who want to be the subject of their own history. It's not that, this is not a call for charity, guys. That's very important. This is not, they are not saying let's go out and do charity. They are saying that the people who are the objects of capitalism want to be the subjects of history. And I think that's really significant to understand, that this is happening right through the 19th century, that there is a strain that goes across the 1857 revolt, because we've seen that as early as 1842 they're writing about the socialist movement in England, and it's the need to understand it. From 1842 all the way out to Tagore 1892, you've got fairly mainstream intellectuals writing about the importance and need of socialism. They didn't have to wait. Again, they didn't read Marx, most of them. In fact, the first article that we know of, or the first few articles that we know of on Marx, that actually take Marx quite, just write about Marx, wait till the 20th century. I mean, in 1891, Bal Gangadhar Tilak mentions Marx. He calls Marx the propounder of socialist rule, and we'll get to Tilak in a second. But it's not just, these earlier thinkers, their journey to socialism comes because they see the wretched condition capitalism imposes and objectifies people, and then the need of people to be the subjects of history. I think that's where they get their socialism from, their understanding of socialism. Because if you read Tagore, again, the quote in the book, 1892, he's not referring to anybody. He's just referring to what he sees out of the window, what he calls the common people and their situation. So this is what I meant by saying that communism or socialism is dialectically produced by the logic of Indian history. It's not something that comes from outside. This is also, it also will come from Moscow and so on, but it is produced out of the logic of Indian history. Okay, so that's that point. Now, to hasten things, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, a series of different uprisings will take place, which we'll spend 2-3 minutes on. But it's important to say that in 1885, a group of pretty heterogeneous middle-class Indian intellectual type people create the Indian National Congress. This is the first attempt at creating a national scale centralized political organization, which is going to demand that this emergent Indian bourgeoisie or this emergent middle class get more say in governing inside India. That this middle class, produced by produced to be, in a sense, the handmaidens of imperialism, no longer wanted to merely take orders from the British. They wanted more room. They were not saying let the British go away. This is not an anti-imperialist organization in 1885. They are merely petitioning. They're an organization of petitioners, petitioning for more room in decision making inside the Indian context, inside the empire. That's what is formed in 1885. But even inside the Congress, there will be an acceleration of all the contradictions, so that by the early 20th century, three important figures in the Congress known as Lal Bal Pal, that's Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal. The three of them, one from Maharashtra, one from Punjab, one from Bengal, become the leaders of the extremist faction inside the Congress. So they start to articulate inside the Congress that petitioning is not getting enough, and they start to very hesitantly make the argument that maybe imperialism is the problem. Hesitantly, they'll make this argument. And in fact, it's Lala Lajpat Rai who will, if you go again to the book and see page 18, it's Lala Lajpat Rai, who will inspire it's not on that page. Lala Lajpat Rai will inspire much of the kind of real extreme politics in Punjab, which will produce Bhagat Singh later. He is a very important figure in Punjabi radicalism. So this is now coming to 1905. When the British, after a period of time, seeing the rise of extremist political activity, seeing the rise of peasant and industrial worker action in the late 19th century, in particularly the province of Bengal, decide to divide Bengal into, now not on administrative grounds, but it looks on religious grounds, a Muslim Bengal, a Hindu Bengal. And there is an uprising in Bengal called the Swadeshi movement in 1905. This is an uprising with great impact because it's against the partition of Bengal, this uprising of the people. And it's against the partition of Bengal, particularly against the religious partition of Bengal. Again, there's one thing to have partitioned Bengal administratively. It is a very large province, but this was malicious, done by Lord Curzon. So that Swadeshi uprising in 1905 takes place at the same time as the 1905 Russian Revolution. Gandhi sitting, now remember I asked you to read Gandhi's, where is it? Russia and India, 1905. Gandhi, sitting in South Africa, where he had gone to make a living as a lawyer, watches what's happening in Bengal, watches what's happening in Russia, and he writes this article in Indian Opinion. It's a Gujarati newspaper he brings out in South Africa. I just want to read one sentence, two sentences from the article toward the end. He says, "The movement in Bengal for the use of Swadeshi goods is much like the Russian movement. Our shackles will break this very day if the people of India become united and patient, love their country, and think of the well-being of their motherland, disregarding their self-interest." It's a very important assessment from Gandhi, because he's saying a couple of things. One, that you need to have unity of political forces. Two, patriotism has to drive the politics. It cannot be self-interest. It has to be something, there needs to be a project. A project needs to be created. Currently, the Congress is based on self-interest. Let's get ourselves into, let's us make decisions and so on. Gandhi says, no, you need a much bigger project than that. Look to Russia, says Gandhi in 1905. A revolution that nonetheless failed, but still. Okay. In the uprising of 1905 in Bengal, and then in the Hartal movement in 1908, when Tilak is arrested in Bombay, many of the political forms that later will get associated with Gandhi emerge. These emerge from popular struggle. For instance, the boycott campaign, the Swadeshi campaign in Bengal, boycott foreign goods, boycott foreign cloth. This happens long before Gandhi becomes part of the movement. This is a tactic and a strategy as well that is developed out of the contradictions of struggle in Bengal. So one, boycott. Second, when Tilak is arrested in Bombay in 1908, there is a hartal. This is the other word that enters the vocabulary as a political instrument. The hartal, the political strike, not the strike for wages, but a political strike. You know, Lenin will observe this hartal in 1908 and write about it, and he'll say this is a very significant development. I'm not sure if they quote Lenin in here on that. But he says a very significant, yeah, page 19. 1908, he writes in an article on inflammable material in world politics in the Bolshevik journal Proletary. On 5th August 1908, he takes note of the 6-day strike of the Bombay working class. You know, this is a strike that the Bombay working class do because they see Tilak as an important figure leading their struggle. And so that is a political strike. That's not an economic strike. It's a huge advance in Indian working class politics. Okay, got 15 minutes to go, so this is a good point to come to Gandhi coming back to. I'm sorry this is going so quickly and it's just an enormous amount of material, but I need to cover this ground so we're ready to deal with the communist movement next time, you know. Otherwise you just don't have the background understanding of this. So there's a lot of material. I'm sorry about that. I was telling Atul my notes are so messy. I mean, you know, I can't even read them. It's so messy. And if I was better organized, I'd have typed out something. But then, anyway, Gandhi needs to be assessed because, in fact, from Gandhi's return to India in 1916, 1516, till the formation of the communist movement, 1920s, 25, you know, that period, Gandhi plays a very important role. But by the way, when I use the word Gandhi, I'm not necessarily talking about Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I'm talking about Gandhianism, you know, this trajectory that Indian nationalism will go within. It's not just this guy Gandhi. You must not look at it like that. Gandhi begins to consolidate a whole section of the Congress around himself. Anyway, Gandhi returns to India and he makes a connection with Gokhale. Gokhale was a so-called moderate in the Congress, not like Tilak, not like you know, Pal, not like Pal, Lal, Bal, not like them. They were the extremists. Gandhi's real mentor is Gokhale, who is the moderate, who goes to England and meets Morley and tries to negotiate and so on. Gandhi's essential political sensibility is moderation. You know, he's not a radical in the sense that Tilak was a radical, or Lala Lajpat Rai is certainly a radical. And then later, you know, we'll see radicalism through Bhagat Singh and others. Gandhi's essential character, political character, was moderation. But he understands something quite interesting when he returns to India from South Africa. He understands, one, that the Congress is a national platform, even though it is politically totally bankrupt, because it seeks to consistently petition the government. It doesn't understand power. They believe if they petition the government will listen to them. In other words, the Congress believes that ideas are important, that the British government is essentially a government of reason and morality, rather than a government of capitalism and exploitation and imperialism. You know, they think that if they have a nice petition, the British will listen to them. They don't understand power. So Gandhi, he's quick to figure out the Congress is useful. And now see dialectics at work. The Congress is useful for its organization, but not for its political line. So let's take the organization from the Congress. That's one. Secondly, students are useful for their immense commitment. Remember what Gandhi said, if we could only have self-sacrifice rather than self-interest. He wrote that in 1905. Students were extraordinarily committed to the politics of their country, but they had been, he said, seduced by the cult of the bomb. In other words, these groups had come up, you know, Yugantar Society and others, influenced to some extent by anarchism, where they would go and they would shoot a police officer or they'd blow up a bank and so on. And he said, you're wasting yourselves because you are unable to, you don't have you don't have mass appeal. And what Gandhi figured out was both the Congress and the cult of the bomb shared this in common. Neither of them had a mass project. That the Congress's lack of a mass project was obvious, you know. It was cut off from the masses. It was a middle class aristocratic group that petitioned the government. They had no, they didn't even attempt to have a mass project. On the other side, the cult of the bomb had no mass project because it was classic anarchist politics. That is, if you can do something that you'll shock the country into action, but you don't have to build a mass project. You don't have to build mass organizations and so on. You're cut off from the masses in the same way as the Congress. And he said, but both of them have something they bring to the table. The cult of the bomb brings immense self-sacrifice, patriotism, not self-interest. The Congress brings the organizational capacity, both useful. Third, he said, you have all these mass struggles taking place. Swadeshi movement, the working class movement in Bombay, organized around first factories and then the political hartal of 1908 and so on. He says there are mass struggles all over. So you have the Congress with an organization, terrible politics. You have the cult of the bomb, great people, great cadre, but not good politics. And you have mass struggles. How to bring all these three together? In fact, that's the Gandhian project. If I could put it bluntly, that's what Gandhianism was about bringing these three things together. And in a sense, the early satyagrahas, you know, whether it's Champaran, and you see this in Champaran, because Champaran, which is the satyagraha on behalf of indigo workers, plantation workers in Bihar, in the province of Champaran in Bihar, you get students like Rajendra Prasad who were, you know, being diverted toward the cult of the bomb. I mean, today it's hard to imagine that Rajendra Prasad, the president of India, could have become an anarchist, you know, but Gandhi pulls them into his ranks and says, you people like Rajendra Prasad and others will come and work with the masses in Champaran. You will work with the masses and we will use the Congress organization to take what's happening in Champaran and make it a national issue. So you see, he uses the satyagraha in Champaran to yoke the Congress, the young students, and mass struggles into a movement. And from Champaran, we get to the non-cooperation movement. Now, it's important to recognize this is the advance that Gandhianism brings to the freedom movement. This is the immense advance. It creates essentially between 1916 and 1922 a national struggle that unifies the Congress, the radical students, and mass struggles into a unity. Of course, the problems are legion. Gandhi's a serial compromiser with the capitalists, as you will see in the Gujarat working class uprising there, just before the non-cooperation movement in Ahmedabad and so on. Gandhi will come there and tell the workers, believe in the capitalists. They are your trustees of wealth and so on. One important limitation for Gandhi is he always compromised with the capitalist class. And, you know, that was there right till the end. Second great compromise is he compromises with caste from the beginning. His problems with caste are in attitude of caste, not with the caste system itself. This is Gandhi's great debate, or rather Ambedkar's great debate against Gandhi. Ambedkar will attack Gandhi for being a compromiser with caste. It's not the case that Gandhi was for the wretchedness of the system. He wanted to reform caste system. Ambedkar says it's just simply not possible. So Gandhi's advance is important. He advances the political project of the freedom struggle. But ideologically, Gandhi is nowhere near at the vanguard of it. And this is why there was a need for the communists to enter the Indian struggle and the socialists. I mean, this was because there was a big gap between the organizational form of the freedom movement that was constructed as Gandhianism. You know, it's fair to call it Gandhianism because they play that role of bringing radical students on into one unity in the Indian National Congress from 1916 onward. That's absolutely correct. There's an advance there, but there's a great limitation. There's a limitation in terms of compromising with capital, compromising with caste, and yes, compromising with imperialism. because Gandhi himself is not going to come out there and call for total, Purna Swaraj, the removal of the British Empire. In fact, the first call for total removal of the British Empire doesn't take place inside India. It takes place in California, in the town of Stockton in California, where the Gadar Babas, these are mostly Sikh, workers and soldiers who fled, India through Hong Kong to Canada, and then they come to California. It's in California that in 1913 they create the Gadar Party. Gadar means the revolt, referring to 1857. They create the Gadar Party in California in 1913, and it was the Gadar Party that gives the first call for Purna Swaraj in 1913. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing. It's nothing to do with Gandhi. Gandhi will continue to try to hold it back. The Congress doesn't call for Purna Swaraj till 1929. So that's 16 full years after the Gadarites call for Purna Swaraj. Just as they say, put that in your pipe and smoke it. That's really quite significant. And that's the necessity of the communist socialist intervention. Because the communists and socialists will fight against the compromises with capitalism, the compromises with caste, and the compromises with imperialism. These three compromises are the historical need for the emergence of the Indian communist movement. The Indian communist movement is not needed to create the freedom struggle. That freedom struggle starts beforehand. But the Indian communist movement was essential to to push on the three, I think, great compromises of Gandhianism with capital, with caste, and with imperialism. These are its three historic compromises that without having had a left develop independent of Gandhianism, we would not have had the freedom movement accelerate in a leftward direction. It would have been impossible. Okay, so the historical necessity of the left comes not to build the mass struggles; those are already there. Not to build this, not to build that, but on these three fronts to drive this agenda. Okay, very quickly, I very much hope that you will keep reading, because in the last part of page 20 to 23, in this last part, you get a little sense of the many organizational forms that are taking place in exile in Berlin, again, as I said, in California, in Afghanistan. You have the great characters like Raja Mahendra Pratap Singh. You have these great characters like Virendranath Chattopadhyay, M.N. Roy, who becomes, one of the founders of the Mexican Communist Party. You get Hardyal. Hardyal is so interesting because Hardyal becomes the secretary of Emma Goldman in California. She is, he is becomes very close to Emma Goldman. I mean, these fascinating characters. Mahendra Pratap Singh ends up, meeting Stalin later. We'll come back to some of these people, but all of this is happening in exile as the socialists outside are gathering forces, as they will gather together to create the communist movement outside. Meanwhile, inside the territory of British India, very brave people are beginning to go out there and develop mass struggles of a different character, beyond wage struggles and so on. There is a way in which the current literature on working class history in India tries to minimize the role of the organizer. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. They try to say that it's funny how the contemporary historians sound like police officials who talk about outside agitators. The role of the organizer is central to building a left. The role of cadre is central to the building of a left. You can't build a left unless you have people who are, as Lenin called them, full-time revolutionaries. It's very difficult. People simply don't have the time of day to build organizations, maintain organizations, to keep in contact between far-flung places, trade union movement in Bengal, in touch with the trade union movement, in Bihar and so on. You need people who will do this work. You will need people who will be able to maintain newspapers, forms of communication, develop strategies out of people's own experiences and so on. So a lot of what we're going to be doing in the next 5 classes is coming back to the role of the organizer. And I just want to underline that when I read Dipesh Chakravarti's book on jute workers' struggles in Bengal, I was quite shocked by how disparaging it was towards the organizers, talking about them being, oh, well, they're just middle class. Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting way in which you don't grasp the complexity of how movements are built and the role of the organizer. So we'll come back to that next time. Okay. I see, just because my eyes are looking at the side, I see that lots of people are wondering where to get the book. You get it at the leftward side. I think that it does cost money, but it's fairly inexpensive. You get the ebook, you can get a discount, become a book club member. It's pretty easy to do. If you're having trouble, you can write to us, let us know, and we can figure that out. Okay. Atul, there's no time really to answer many questions and things. What do you think?
Yes, but I think we can get back to like what we have done before with other courses. I have noted down all the questions, and we can get back to the people, sending it to all of them through
Chalo,
mail.
that's not bad. Yeah.
Yes.
At least I got Champaran in there, Atul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bihar is making more than a cameo appearance.
It
Somebody asked
should.
a question, huh?
I was saying Bihar should be like we are the people who is doing like going to bring revolution.
Yeah, well, revolution will start from Begusarai.
No
From
comments on that.
Begusarai to Delhi. That's what I heard.
No
Uh,
comments on that.
Nitish, Kerala is coming, don't worry. Kerala will make its appearance soon. Yeah, somebody wrote also not to forget Kerala. Kerala is coming. Somebody did ask, and maybe I'll do this quickly, it's a good way to end. Why is Punjab such a central place? I didn't spend much time, I'm sorry, on Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh is such a key figure. And in fact, I maybe the best way to end the class will be to read from Why I'm an Atheist. There's a section I particularly like. But why is it? Well, there's several reasons. One is that the assault on agriculture in Punjab was quite severe. I mean, they saw this very fertile land and so on, but also there was this idea that there were martial races in India. And this theory comes from the uprising of 1857. Those who rose up, the British said, were feminine races, like the Bengalis. And they began to say that anybody who rose up against the East India Company was feminine. Those who helped crush the rebellion were masculine. So Punjabis become the martial races. It's then that Nepal, and particularly the Gurkhas, are seen as great fighters. I mean, look, there's nothing natural about Gurkhas being great fighters. Sorry to say to our Nepali comrades, there's nothing natural. Every country produces people. I mean, what's natural about it? But there was this theory that the Punjabi was a martial race, and so they were heavily recruited into the military. And it's through the military that peasants, Lenin writes that a soldier is a peasant with a rifle. And in the military, the peasantry of Punjab were able to get an education. They were also able to travel to different places, and they understood certain things. And when they returned home, the promises made to them were often violated. Many of them got to go abroad. They got to go and fight in China in the 20s and came back frustrated. The Gadar Babas who are there in California, many of them were demobilized soldiers. Some of them didn't want to fight in World War I and therefore escaped out of India and so on. And so that experience of being military people was certainly very significant for Punjab and Punjab rebellion. That, you know, this is a lot like in the United States when African American soldiers come back from World War One and come back radicalized by the experience of having gone abroad, made certain promises which were betrayed. It's very much like the West African soldiers who went to fight in World War One, came back, and so on. This plays a role. This military thing plays a role. Anyway, Bhagat Singh, an incredible young, radical, joins the Hindustani Republican Army. Then later it becomes Hindustani Socialist Republican Army. They add the word socialist as they radicalize. When he's in prison for an act of actually not terrorism, he's not a terrorist. They did a kind of drama. They threw bombs into the legislative assembly, but without intending to hurt anybody. It was to raise awareness. Bhagat Singh in Why I'm an Atheist writes about this. He writes about the use of violence and force in the context of Gandhianism, because his entire career was to the left of Gandhi. This is in 1930-31. He writes, it's a little bit, but I'll read the whole bit, okay? And then we can end. My previous faith and convictions underwent a remarkable modification. This is after he read a lot of stuff. And what was he reading? He says later, I got ample opportunity to study various ideals of the world revolution. I studied Bakunin, the anarchist leader, something of Marx, the father of communism, and much of Lenin, Trotsky and others, the men who had successfully carried out a revolution in their country. They were all atheists. Bakunin's God and State, though only fragmentary, is an interesting subject of study, and so on. He was arrested in Lahore in May of 1927 and spent his time in prison. He writes, my faith and convictions underwent a remarkable modification. The romance of the violent methods alone, which was so prominent amongst our predecessors, was replaced by serious ideas. No more mysticism, no more blind faith. Realism became our cult. This is the journey of this generation of student radicalisms from the cult of the bomb to Marxism, essentially, is what he's writing about. Use of force justifiable when resorted to as a matter of terrible necessity. Non-violence as policy indispensable for all mass movements. That's just a beautiful formula. Non-violence as policy indispensable for all mass movements, use of force justifiable when resorted to as a matter of terrible necessity. Terrible necessity. Bhagat Singh was one of the most important figures of Indian nationalism, and had he not been executed, would have been one of the most significant left leaders in the nationalist movement. It turns out that in all our movements, significant left leaders get executed. Bhagat Singh is one of them. Can you imagine this young man executed in his early 20s in 1930? Imagine this young man in the next 30 years, into the 30s, 40s, and 50s in India. If there was a Bhagat Singh in 1947, if there was a Bhagat Singh sitting there in the Constituent Assembly debates, debating what the Constitution could look like. I mean, I'm not one to believe that the individual plays such an important role, but certainly there are some individuals that play a very significant role. Okay, we're going to leave now. Next class, we'll be reading the essay that I published in Monthly Review called The Internationalist Lenin. We have two essays by one of the best historians of early Indian communism, Suchetna Chattopadhyay. This will all be there in the syllabus. We have Amrit Diol, an essay that I didn't know about but found recently on the Kirti Kisan Party. This is the legacy of the Gadar movement in Punjab, the emergence of the worker peasant parties. And those will be our 4 readings. Again, keep going through this because we're reading the whole book. And recommended, if you want, you can read my book Red Star Over the Third World. It'll be the background. Okay, guys, see you next class on the 26th of October. Almost said something wrong, Atul. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And we'll meet everyone then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay.
Atul, Nitish, let's meet for a little bit. I'll send you
Yes.
a number, huh?
Yeah.
Bye.